right. Good morning, everyone. I'm Vanessa Weisbrod. I'm really excited to be presenting to you today. So how many of you saw the study in gastroenterology this week? Okay, just a few of you. Okay, so I have a fresh audience. Okay, you guys don't count. Well, I'm hoping that I'm going to blow your mind in the next 20 minutes or less, and that you won't end up throwing tomatoes at me. Okay, so just to start, the studies that I'm about to talk about, we had some wonderful donors who contributed, the Celiac Disease Foundation, the Dr. Starr Institute, and our Children's National Board of Visitors. So thanks to our sponsors. So some of the information that I'm going to share today is pending publication. If you see that no photo, please don't be tweeting those out. But anything in relation to the kitchen study is published, and those things you can share. So I want to start out with why we did these studies. So for those of you with celiac in the room, when you were diagnosed, your doctor probably told you to live your gluten-free lifestyle in a certain way. They probably told you to have 2 toasters. They probably told you to have separate pots and pans and cutting boards and knives and not to share things. But why did they tell you to do it that way? Because there's no data. Because you were trying to prevent cross-contamination, but the way in which they were telling you to do it was just because they thought that was the right thing to do. Until September 24th of this year, there were no studies published telling us actually how much cross-contact could occur if you shared those items in your kitchen. So we did this because the current recommendations are not based on data, and we wanted to have data so that when we're telling our patients and families in our clinics how to best manage the diet, we can say it with evidence and confidence. So we hear a lot of things from our families when they come into our clinic. Parents say, my kids can't play with Play-Doh at school, that we have to have 2 toasters, we have to have a dedicated set of everything, and then they say that we have to travel with all of these items. So they go on the road with a second kitchen. They say they feel like they have a clown car, and one of my favorite patient families of all time said that every time she went on a trip, she felt like she was shoving an elephant onto the airplane because she had no problem checking her luggage that had clothes in it and toiletries and other things, but she could not check the suitcase that had the toaster, the second set of pots and pans, the pot holders, and everything else, just in case the luggage got lost. She wouldn't be able to cook for her child with celiac disease. So that image of an elephant getting on an airplane has always stuck with me. So I was really happy I found a stock photo with one. So, as I said, these recommendations are not based on data, and we don't want to be telling you to travel with an elephant anymore. So we wanted to be able to say with confidence that you could do this. So we did a study, and we're very, very honored that last week it was published in one of the most prestigious gastroenterology journals in the world. It's called Gastroenterology. And in the first hour it was published, it was downloaded 2,100 times. So I think people care just a little bit about what we did. But here's what we've heard so far from the celiac community. You guys are trying to make us sick so your hospital can make more money, so you're telling us to contaminate things. You are crazy. And I've had people email me demons with gluten trickling down that I'm trying to gluten them. We're fraudulent, we're crazy, and we're irresponsible. So I just want to start by telling you who did these studies, okay? Some of them are in the room today. They were doctors, they were researchers, they were educators from our hospital here in DC, Children's National, as well as from Boston Children's Hospital in Boston. Almost everybody on the study team either has celiac disease themselves or a child with celiac. Personally, I have a 6-year-old with celiac, and I have it myself. It affects our lives too. So I assure you, we're not trying to make you more sick. We're not trying to make money for our hospital. We're just trying to help us all have an informed, better quality of life. And these are just a few of the pictures from our study day. Up top, you see some of our kids in the program and healthy siblings who helped do the actual experiment. So I'm hoping that by showing you our real faces, you will not think that we are lab rats in a sterile environment, but actually people who want to help you. And so with that, I will talk about what we found. So we had a few aims of the studies. We wanted to quantify gluten transfer from common supplies via the hands of children. This was the school products one that I'm going to talk about as well. And then to study the efficacy of hand washing, so that we were trying to remove the gluten from hands and from surface area. We wanted to then quantify gluten transfer from gluten-containing pasta, bread, and cupcakes. So when we would cut or cook things in contaminated water or use contaminated knives or toasters, could we then transfer that to gluten-free? And then we wanted to see if we could prevent the transfers by washing and undertaking normal hygiene practices. So again, here are just a few pictures from the study day of kids participating. Every child had a behavioral observation person overseeing them, and also behavior observations when we did the kitchen activities as well. So we really documented how these things happened. So the first question we get asked is, how did you find out how much gluten was transferred? So I want to put you all at ease that we did a really good job with this. We packaged all of our samples in randomized bags, so when we sent them off to the lab, they didn't know what they were looking at. It was totally blinded. Most of the samples were shipped to a lab in Vermont that is one of the leading authorities on determining gluten content in food. Some of the samples we processed in our lab at Children's Hospital in DC, and these were mostly in relation to the school's data that I'm going to show you. When you see the results, what we did was we homogenized the entire slice of bread that we tested, or this entire portion of pasta. And what that means is that they ground it all up so that we were testing the full amount there. So we weren't just breaking off a little piece or a pea-sized crumble, which many of you probably hear of with the NEMA sensor, just test a small amount of it. We homogenized the entire slice so that we could find how much gluten was really there. And then we used the R5 ELISA, which is the traditional way of measuring gluten. So for activities that involved children, we enrolled 30 healthy children. So most of them were siblings of kids with celiac disease in our program. They were ranging in age from 2 to 18. We tested lots of different scenarios. In the kitchen, we looked at cooking pasta in the same water, slicing cupcakes that were gluten-containing and then gluten-free, shared toasters, both pop-up and rolling. And then in the classroom, we looked at PlayDoh, home economics baking projects, paper mache, dry pasta, and cooked pasta in sensory tables. We used lots of different products. I'm not going to name them all. They're ones you're all familiar with. But we did make sure before we did the study that we tested them. So we made sure that the ones that said they were gluten-free were actually gluten-free, and the ones that were not gluten-free actually had gluten in them. So to make sure that we didn't transfer gluten between activities, we had this complete clean. I'm not going to describe the whole thing, but we've made sure that in between each activity there was no gluten present so that we weren't carrying things over. Okay, so we're going to start with pasta, and thanks to Dr. Kersner for helping with these lovely animations. I don't know where he went, but that's okay. So we started out by boiling water and cooking gluten-containing pasta in the boiling water. We tested both fusilli and penne. After it was cooked for 12 minutes, which was according to package instructions, we used a handheld strainer to remove the gluten-containing pasta from the water, but we kept the same water, and then we put gluten-free pasta into the water and cooked it. Then we took it out and we divided it into 2-ounce portions, which is the recommended serving size, and we homogenized those portions to decide how much gluten was in that full portion of pasta. So here's what we found. Obviously, it was all contaminated. That red line is the 20 parts per million line that we're all familiar with. It's the threshold set by the FDA for how much gluten is we can say less than 20 parts per million means the product can be deemed as gluten-free. So any line that's above that would not be considered gluten-free. So something just interesting to point out is that the fusilli pasta had almost double the transfer as the penne pasta. But again, the real takeaway home here is that don't cook gluten-free pasta in the same water used for gluten-containing. Raise your hand if you believe me. Okay, so there's no arguments in the room that you should not contaminate pasta by cooking gluten-free and gluten-containing water. Okay, there were 12 samples. Okay, let's remember that, 12 samples. It only took 12 for me to convince you that this was not okay to do, right? Okay, we've got it. So then we tested washing, okay? So we, again, cooked gluten-containing pasta in boiling water, in clean boiling water, and then, so it's contaminated now. There's gluten in the water. Then we took out that pasta and the water, and in half the pots, we washed them with soap and water. The other half, we used no soap, no sponge. We just used a handheld sprayer in the sink, and we rinsed the pots, okay? So we did not scrub them. Then we put new water in the pots, put gluten-free pasta, and we cooked it according to the package instructions. We then divided it, and we measured it for gluten, how much gluten was transferred from those pots. Here's what we found. None. Just rinsing. Exact same outcomes as scrubbing with soap and water, okay? There was no gluten detectable, Okay, so it wasn't like it was 10 parts per million or 18, there was none detectable. Okay, so what does this tell us? That we can wash gluten away. So by using simple hygiene procedures in the kitchen, just like you would wash a pot or a pan to get rid of bacteria from chicken or anything else, you can wash it away and use those same pots. So now maybe my elephant suitcase lady doesn't have to take quite as big of a suitcase with her on the airplane because she can use grandma's pots and pans. Okay, so then now's here where we get into the you're going to think I'm a little crazy. So we did it all again. We cooked the gluten-containing pasta in the water. Then we took it out. Then we took the gluten-free pasta and cooked it in the dirty water. Then we put the pasta in a strainer and we rinsed it with a handheld strainer or with a handheld sprayer in the sink. Okay? So now what did we find? It was mostly gone, and actually all of those would have qualified for a gluten-free label. We did detect some gluten, so we are not confident to say that this is a way in which we should operate, but it does present another question for us to do more research on, that maybe we can rinse it away, and maybe there are other ways to remove gluten. So something we're still thinking about. So then we got cupcakes. We had very heavily frosted gluten-containing cupcakes. Then we used the same knife to cut a gluten-free cupcake. So then we measured how much gluten was there. Then we started over. We cut a new gluten-containing cupcake. Then we washed the knife using one of 3 different methods. We either washed it with soap and water, we just rinsed it, or we used a wet wipe to try and remove it to see if it would be okay. Then we homogenized the entire cupcake. So again, we ground up the entire thing so we would see how much gluten was transferred in that whole cupcake. This is a picture so you can see what happened. So you see there was lots of crumbs, there was lots of frosting on those knives. Okay? So now here is what we found. So the blue line represents before we washed. Okay? So there's only 2 samples that were greater than 20 parts per million before washing. After washing, the green line, obviously all of them were below. Are we telling you to use the same knife to cut gluten-free and gluten-containing? No. We're telling you to use good hygiene and to wash them in between and to feel okay that you could wash those kitchen utensils and then proceed to slice something that was gluten-free. Or remember, you could always just do the gluten-free things first. Okay, now let's get on to toasters. They're calling from the front desk. Sorry. Okay, multitasking. All right, so toasters, here's the big one. The headline read, "Do celiac families need 2 toasters?" So we toasted bread in our very, very busy hospital cafeteria. If any of you have been to Children's National, you know that cafeteria has tons of people coming through it, lots of different things being toasted. There's about 8 different kinds of bread, bagels, English muffins that go into it. So we toasted samples in there during the busy breakfast rush. Then we also tested shared pop-up toasters. So immediately after toasting gluten-containing bread, we then toasted gluten-free bread. There was tons of crumbs, which I'm going to show you in a second. Here we go. So you can see the crumbs that were in the hospital cafeteria. These are the actual photos from the day of testing. And then this is the pop-up toaster that we use. So there was lots of gluten-containing crumbs. All right, are you ready to see what we found? Here we go. Not one. We really tried, guys. All I wanted was to have this like huge line going up, 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 up. And we couldn't get one. Actually, we did get one, but not from this. It was when I went and took a spoonful of crumbs and I dumped it into the bag just to make sure we were measuring that there was gluten there. But none of our samples. Originally, we actually had only done 28 samples. And because we just couldn't believe it, we went back and did 20 more so that we had 40 data points with our paper so that we felt really strong about what we found. Now, I'm not telling you to share toasters, and I'm not telling you to go to a hotel and use the rolling toaster and let it fall in. I'm just saying to think about this information and to maybe feel a little less anxious when you go to grandma's house. My husband's family is not gluten-free, and when my son and I go there in the past, I've never, ever, ever used their toaster. And you know, the last 2 times we've gone since we did this study, I did, and we were okay. So what I don't want you to leave here thinking is that I'm telling you to contaminate yourself, because I'm not. I'm telling you to think about it and how maybe if you see a toaster and you want to toast that bread that doesn't look too dirty, you know, maybe it's okay. So, okay, I'll take a couple questions. So we didn't use cast iron because traditionally you wouldn't cook pasta in the boiling capacity in a cast iron pot, so we didn't test those, but it's definitely something that we'll test in the future in terms of other types of cooking. Mm-hmm.
Two questions. One, with the knife experiment, went sort of kind of quick. Did you only test the knife that had been washed with soap and water, or was some of it just rinsing the knife?
So a third of them were, 10 of the samples had soap and water and a scrub. 10 of them were just rinsed with the handheld sprayer, and 10 of them we used a wet wipe to wipe them off.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And so the other question, I know it's brand new, September 24th, but are these studies being replicated elsewhere to prove their validity?
So we're already planning a larger scale studies with them, and in the first week we've been contacted by over a dozen programs around, not even just in our country, but also in New Zealand and Australia, to partner with them to all of us be replicating this. So it's definitely something that's happening. Yes. Sorry, I didn't intend to do this now, but we can go ahead. Mm-hmm. I don't think there was. I think you might have looked at them. There wasn't more. There. Okay. Well, we can check that later because I want to get through my presentation. I'm sorry? It was, yes. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to move on from kitchen because we have a lot of families with kids and talk just briefly about school supplies. So Play-Doh is probably the most common thing that we get asked about when it comes to little kids going to school. So we had 30 kids play with Play-Doh for 5 minutes. We then rubbed pieces of gluten-free bread on their hands and separate pieces of gluten-free bread on the tables in front of them to see if it transferred from the different, either their hands or from the table. Then we had them play with Play-Doh again, and then we randomly assigned them to either washing their hands with soap and water while singing Happy Birthday, to just rinsing with water alone while singing Happy Birthday, or washing their hands using an antibacterial wet wipe. Then we again tested the whole slice of bread to determine, so this is an interesting point. So during our study day, we had one participant in the study who made a lovely towerish symbol out of his entire container of Play-Doh and then proceeded to bend over and put his mouth over the entire structure. So we said, stop, go get me a container of Play-Doh. If that kid ate the whole thing, how much gluten would he have consumed? So any guesses as to how much gluten is in a full 3-ounce container of Play-Doh? 32,253 parts per million. Please don't eat a container of Play-Doh. No, this was just in the container of Play-Doh. So we took a full container of Play-Doh and tested how much gluten was in that container if they ate the container of Play-Doh itself. Please never eat Play-Doh. That is not good for anybody. Okay, so what did we find when we ran the samples? So the purple line are the hand transfers and the green lines are the table transfers. So there were 0 samples that came back contaminated from the hands. So this is before washing. This is just touching the Play-Doh, then touching gluten-free bread. The 2 samples that had high levels from the tables had pea-sized pieces of Play-Doh on them. So again, if you eat the Play-Doh, that's too much. But if you look at all of the green ones that did not have that, they were well below the line. Then if we washed hands and tables, this is what we got. So you can see no gluten detected. So again, they could play with the Play-Doh, they could use it on the table, we could wash using one of 3 methods, and they were good to go. So then we did a home economics project. We did very similar methods to all of the others. I'm going to go through it very quickly. They made, the picture will show it even prettier. Okay, so they rolled out cookie dough. They used cookie cutters to slice them. They put them on a tray. As you can see, here are 3 of the kids. They had very different amounts of flour on their hands before we rubbed them with with gluten-free bread. So now, do we think that there was a big transfer? You're all correct. There was a lot of gluten transferred. We don't want to be doing this, and we don't want to be eating that bread, okay? But then we washed, okay? So again, we had the 3 groups of either soap and water, water alone, or a wet wipe. And here is what we found with the washing. So there are three very distinct categories, okay? The first one, where there was still a lot of gluten there, was in the water alone group. The soap and water group had pretty good removal, as did the wet wipes. They were about equal. The interesting thing is that it was way harder to get the gluten to come off the tables than it was off of their hands. So this needs a whole lot more study to figure out what's really best in terms of home economics classes. So we would definitely not recommend using the gluten-containing flours and then eating on those surfaces without heavy-duty cleaning. So then we looked at paper mache. We did very similar methodology to everything I've already described, and here's what we saw. Lots and lots. These were actually in the thousands, one up to 13,000 making paper mache art projects. So there was a lot of gluten transferred. Then we looked at dry pasta and cooked pasta in a sensory table. So in many early childhood programs, they'll play with pasta in tables. The cooked pasta is meant to simulate feeling something like worms, which lots of our kids didn't actually like. So I'll show you what we found. Okay, so the top is the cooked and dyed pasta. On the bottom is the dry pasta. So as you can imagine, the blue lines are the cooked pasta. So there were really, really high transfers. The P9, the participant number 9, that was a young child who said, "It's disgusting. I feel like I'm out in the backyard touching worms. I don't want to play with it." So there was a very low transfer there. But the others who actually dug their hands in did have pretty high levels of transfer. However, with the dry pasta, there was no serious levels of cross contact. So, we're talking about things like making macaroni necklaces at camp or at Girl Scouts or wherever they may be. Touching it is really not presenting with a very high risk of transfer. Okay, so there are a couple of other studies that have in different ways looked at cross contact. One looked at different utensils than we looked at, and they found the exact same thing that we did, that there was not significant transfer. You guys will get copies of all the slides so you can look at them in more depth later. But the bottom line was that they found almost exactly the same thing that we did. There was another study looking at commercial catering kitchens for baking, and could you have simultaneous use of gluten-containing flour in the bakery with gluten-free flour in the same space? And it's interesting because they actually found that if you had a significant distance of 2 meters, which is about 6.5 feet, and that you were using gluten-free ingredients and clean utensils, that they were able to safely produce gluten-free food in that space. We're not saying that we should do that yet. We have a lot more study to do on this, but it's at least very interesting to see our results coupled with these and think about how we can study this in larger ways. So before we did this study, there was no data. Now we have some data that agrees with some of the other studies that have looked at similar but different things. So we're really excited about that we're starting on a path where down the road we can make evidence-informed recommendations to our patients and families so that when you are practicing procedures to manage the gluten-free diet, they're ones that we feel really, really good about. What we know now is that some activities pose a higher risk of cross-contact than others, and that we might not need a dedicated set of utensils or equipment in all of the scenarios. Again, we need lots of more bigger studies on these things before changing all of our practices. When it comes to school supplies, there's definitely a higher risk with some things like paper mache and cooking activities than there are with things like Play-Doh and dry pasta. My 6-year-old is using regular Play-Doh at school now. After we did this study, his teacher and him have a deal that when they're done, everybody in the class washes their hands, they wipe down all the tables, and he has never been happier than using the same Play-Doh that all of his friends are using. If you are uncomfortable with this, don't do it. If you would rather your child use gluten-free Play-Doh, that is perfectly okay too. For home economics projects, paper mache and cooked and dyed pasta, we still say do not use those gluten-containing ones. There is a really high risk of transfer. And that in all of these scenarios, the risk of cross-contact was dramatically reduced by simple hygiene practices. So again, hand washing is really, really key. Now, to clarify all of this, I am not telling you to eat gluten. I am not telling you to put yourself or your child in a situation where you think they're going to be exposed to gluten at levels that may cause harm. I am not telling you to be uncomfortable with anything that you eat, and I promise I'm not trying to make you sick. So, to conclude, and what I really want you to think about is that the previous recommendations we've given are not based on data. This is the first time we've had really, really good data to look at these scenarios. So I'm asking you, please just don't dismiss it. Think about it. Think about how it can help improve your quality of life, and help us. Help us do bigger studies. We need to look at this in much, much larger sample sizes. We need funding. We need lots and lots of healthy volunteers. So if you have friends, family members, siblings who don't have celiac, we obviously don't want to expose people with celiac to levels of gluten that we're unsure how will affect them. So we need healthy people to participate in these studies. And if you see really nasty comments online, perhaps think about responding to them and say, read the study, talk to the researchers, and think about how this could perhaps help you improve your quality of life instead of just calling us demons. So, so thank you all, and I think we're going to let Mary do her presentation, and then we'll take more questions at the end.